This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. The legendary anti-war priest, activist, and poet Father Dan Berrigan has died at the age of 94. This is part 2 of our discussion following our global broadcast with 3 guests remembering his life and legacy. In New York, we're joined by Frida Berrigan. She's the niece of Dan Berrigan. She's the daughter of Father Dan Berrigan's brother, Phil Berrigan. She herself a long-time peace activist, very much following in the tradition of her family, of her father, Phil Berrigan, her uncle, Dan Berrigan, and her mother, Liz McAllister. Frida writes a regular column for Waging Nonviolence. Also in New York, Father John Deere, a Catholic priest, longtime peace activist, one of Dan Berrigan's closest friends, worked with him for 35 years. He's Father Dan's literary executor and the editor of 5 books of his writings. We're here in New Orleans, Louisiana, and joined in the studios of public television station WLAE by Bill Quigley, professor and director of the Stuart H. Smith Law Clinic and Center for Social Justice and the Gillis Long Poverty Law Center at Loyola University, one of Dan Berrigan's attorneys. We welcome you all back to Democracy Now! Now, we ended with you, Bill, telling us about an action that you represented Father Dan over, but I was wondering if you could elaborate a little more now that we have more time. Explain exactly when it was back in 1989 and what Father Dan did, the circumstances, what he was protesting, and what he did.
Well, Father Dan was at that time teaching at Loyola University in New Orleans, and the Jesuits, as you talked about, were assassinated at the university in Salvador.
These were the 6 Jesuit priests, their housekeeper and her daughter.
Correct. And there was a nationwide call for civil disobedience to resist U.S. policy in El Salvador. And I was called to a meeting at Loyola by a group of people who were going to engage in civil disobedience, they said, and I've been to many meetings like that over the years, and there in the group was Dan Berrigan. And we realized, because he was there, that this was a very serious group. He didn't try to be the leader. He didn't try to be outspoken or anything. He was quiet and a presence there as the group decided what they were going to do. And they decided they were going to go to downtown New Orleans, into the federal building, and block all of the elevators in the federal building so the business could not continue as usual on a Friday afternoon. He, along with other Jesuit priests, some students, some other anti-war activists in the community, sat in these elevators and just peacefully prayed and sang and stopped all the business in the federal building for some time. The interesting thing was that the prosecutor, the U.S. attorney, was a Jesuit-trained lawyer. And he came blowing into the room, into the lobby of the place, and said, look, I went to Jesuit high school, I went to Jesuit university, I went to Jesuit law school. I respect the Jesuits, but you have to follow authority. You have to follow the law. Obedience is one of the things that you have to do as a Jesuit. And he was preaching to the Jesuits to follow his orders. And they said, well, no, we're not going to do that. And he said, well, I'm going to call your provincial and tell your provincial to order you out of these things, because I don't want to arrest you. You've made your point. I don't want to arrest you. And they said, well, you don't have to call our provincial. Our provincial's right over here.
Explain what the provincial is.
The provincial is like the local leader of the Jesuits. So he was going to call their boss, who was going to tell them that to get out of the elevators and stop the civil disobedience. Well, the provincial, the boss, was there, and he was there in support of the activities that they took. And so the prosecutor threw up his hands, arrested everybody. They were processed and the like. And then the semester ended not long after, and it came time for the trial, and Dan Berrigan said, I'm not coming back for the trial. It's ridiculous to come all the way back from New York just for a trial for, this sort of thing compared to what the government did. And so he didn't come. He wrote a nice letter to the judge just saying, I'm not coming. I just want to let you know. And a couple of weeks later, he was arrested in New York City I received a call from Ramsey Clark, who
the former U.S. Attorney General.
U.S. Attorney General, who represented him on many things. I'm one of dozens, if not hundreds, of lawyers for Daniel Berrigan because of his activities over the years. And he had been arrested and kept in jail in New York because he had skipped the trial in New Orleans. He agreed to come back. Somebody posted a bond for him. He came back a few weeks later to face this horrifying contempt of court charge for, skipping out on court and the big threats of going to jail. And of course, he was not intimidated whatsoever by going to jail. He took the courts very gently. They had a job to do whatever you want to do. We'll do whatever we have to do. And so when he came to court, people were afraid that he was going to be kept in jail in New Orleans for a while. So his good friend, the President of the United States on our TV show, Martin Sheen, came down as a character witness for him. And the two of them, when they came into the courthouse, essentially shut down the entire courthouse because everybody wanted to see Martin Sheen and Daniel Berrigan. So all the other courts closed. A lot of the federal building people streamed in to see him. And they were charming, and they were light, and they were laughing, and they told how serious it was and what they had done and the like. And the judge ultimately gave him some community service hours that he had to follow through on, which, of course, his life was made up of community service. And but he was a very quiet but forceful leader with people. He would speak when asked to, and when he did speak, he was powerful. But he didn't go out of his way to make a lot of speeches.
And I wanted you to elaborate on Dan's response to you when you interviewed him on stage, when you said to him, you're considered a hero by so many.
Right. Well, actually, hundreds of thousands of people, I think, considered him a hero. And so I asked him on the stage, and we had not rehearsed, so I didn't know what the answer was. And I asked him, who are your heroes? Because you're a hero to so many. And he said, Bill, I don't believe in heroes. I believe in community. And it is in community, it is in movements, it is in people gathering together that courage is displayed, that inspiration happens, that sacrifice happens, and the like. And we have seen and celebrate, even after his death now, the hundreds of activities and communities across not just the United States, but Europe and around the world who have adopted many of the activities and the actions that he has done. The Plowshares movement. There is a young woman in Omaha this month who is going to trial. I'm representing her standby counsel, Jessica Resnicek, who broke out the windows of Northrop Grumman outside of Air Force Base there, to resist the next generation of weapons of mass destruction that they are making so much money off of. The Sister Megan Rice, who's been on your show before, Michael Borcha Obed, John Deere, Frida. There's just hundreds and hundreds of people and hundreds of actions of this community of peacemakers. And that is really, I think, his legacy to us as a prophet, as a truth teller, but also as a community builder and inspirer, and as an activist himself.
I want to turn to actor Martin Sheen, who played Father Dan Berrigan in the 1982 film The King of Prussia, which tells the story of how Berrigan and others became active in the nuclear weapons, the anti-nuclear weapons movement.
Before he went into prison for the Catonsville 9 action, he gave a series of talks. He would surface, he was underground, and he would surface every now and then, and he was holding a kind of a press conference with some peace people and reporters, and he was just about to be captured and sent away. And someone in the crowd, he was advocating that all of us should risk arrest and prison if we really wanted to stop this war, because that's what the government was doing with young men's lives. So we had to step up. And someone in the audience said, well, fine, Father Berrigan, it's all well and good for you to advocate going to prison. You don't have any children. What about us? We have children. What's going to happen to our children if we go to prison? And Dan said, what's going to happen to them if you don't? And that had a most profound effect on me. I thought, oh, my God, yes, we are called to nonviolent resistance that is very costly. And if what we believe doesn't cost us something, then we're left to question its value. And still, I didn't join Dan for a protest until 1986. I was in New York doing a film, and I had a day off, and so I heard about a demonstration over at the 42nd Street, trying to block the entrance to where the McGraw-Hill building, where they were planning basically to place nuclear weapons in outer space. This was the so-called Reagan's strategic plan, Star Wars. And I went to that demonstration, and Dan was there, and it was my first arrest for a noble cause, and it was the happiest day of my life. And I'll never forget, it was so disarming. Dan was, kind of leading the group in prayer and singing. And the police finally arrived and said, come on, you guys, you got 2 minutes to disperse. And Dan said to the presiding officer, come on, officer, you believe in this cause. Get in here and join us. And he backed away. He said, oh, no, Father, please, no. He made it so human, so down to earth. But the world has lost a great peacemaker and humanitarian and poet and such an inspiration and such a it's hard to describe the effect he's had without becoming I don't know what it's like you're describing someone that could not possibly have lived, and yet we knew him and loved him and worked with him and celebrated with him. And in a few days, we're going to gather to celebrate his life and to send him on his way.
The action you're talking about, Bill, and that Father Dan was involved with, was protesting the killing of 6 Jesuit priests, their housekeeper and her daughter in El Salvador. Why was he occupying the federal building here in New Orleans? What did the U.S. government have to do with it?
So he was, as so many were, felt terribly bad about the murder of these folks. But the problem was that they were really murdered by the United States government. Not directly, but indirectly. The people who threatened the Jesuits, who had threatened and murdered and assassinated people all over Latin America and South America, had been trained by the U.S. Army School of Americas, which was originally in Panama, has since been moved to Fort Benning and renamed other times. But it was United States policy that pushed, funded, trained, and activated the people who killed these Jesuits, their housekeeper, other sisters, other peasants, other activists, labor organizers, and the like. So it was an act of remembering their sorrow, but also an act of resistance and challenge to the United States government, which Dan Berrigan would always remind us that Martin Luther King said, the United States is the world's greatest purveyor of violence. So it was to fight against our government and say no more, not in our name, again and again. It wasn't the first time. So it was the essence of the fight in Central America that he was involved with, obviously in Vietnam, obviously Iraq, all over the world. And so it was to try to hold our government accountable, try to witness and say, not in our name will we allow this to happen.
I wanted to go back then from 1989 to 1968 to the Catonsville action, when he and 8 others, Father Dan, as well as his brother Phil Berrigan, and other peace activists, burned the A1 draft files, over 300 of them, in Catonsville, Maryland, using homemade napalm. The statement that Father Dan Berrigan wrote famously said, "Our apologies, good friends, for the fracture of good order, the burning of paper instead of children." Frida Berrigan, if you can talk about, well, the beginning of the whole plowshares movement. What your father, Phil Berrigan, and Dan Berrigan, how they decided to engage in this kind of direct action that would carry on for decades and carries on, you know, beyond the lives of both Phil and Dan Berrigan now.
Well, I think the key word here for the plowshares movement is responsibility. My father, my mother, Uncle Dan, the plowshares community took nuclear weapons personally. They feel personally responsible for the fact that the United States holds the wherewithal to destroy our entire planet hundreds, perhaps thousands of times over, and that we threaten on a daily basis, that the United States threatens on a daily basis the world, the whole world, with nuclear winter. So as Christians, as peacemakers, as people of conscience, they said, we are responsible for these weapons, and our faith calls us to disarm them, to transform them, and so in order to do that, there's walking through fences, there's going over sensors, there's breaking into buildings, and there's a taking responsibility for these weapons. So that was a real thread throughout our whole lives, is we are responsible. We can't just say, oh, well, the people in Washington have that under control. We are responsible. And so my father, Uncle Dan, my mother, so many others risked long times in jail, risked everything, risked being away from us. Who would want to be away from me as a small child, right? And so, and then that idea really took off. There have been hundreds of plowshares actions. There perhaps are plowshares actions being planned and conceived of right now, where people of conscience feel this call out of the Hebrew scriptures, the Old Testament prophets, Micah and Isaiah, to beat swords into plowshares, to turn spears into pruning hooks, to make weapons into implements of life. So it was such a courageous idea to be gripped, to take something off a page and to put it into life, to take something written 2,000 years ago and say, this is what I need to do, is such a profound and just out there thing to do, and yet it has gripped so many people, and it certainly set up our lives as the children of Phil and Liz, the nieces and nephews of Dan Berrigan. It set up our lives where many family reunions were held outside of courthouses and in prison visiting rooms throughout our lives, and the function of poetry and prophecy in our lives has just been, well, it's been strange. You know, it's been strange, but it has been magical too. So I think that the reverberations of these witnesses are things that, you know, will live on in the world for generations to come, and I take great comfort. I take great comfort in that.
In 2006, the late author Kurt Vonnegut spoke at the celebration of Father Dan's 85th birthday in New York.
Dear Father Berrigan, dear Daniel, dear Dan, we love you. This is such a happy occasion for us because you are still among us, being what you are, doing what you do. They say now that you are 85 years old. But a large part of you is now 2006 years old. And we wish that part of you another 1,000 years as a presence here on earth, if we have that long. Dear Father Berrigan, dear Daniel, dear Dan, we love you.
That was Kurt Vonnegut speaking at the 85th birthday party of Father Dan Berrigan. And this is the historian Howard Zinn, the late great historian who wrote People's History of the United States, also speaking at that same event in 2006, marking Father Dan Berrigan's 85th birthday.
I met Dan in early 1968. For the first time, we met in an apartment in Greenwich Village. And in a few hours, we were on our way to North Vietnam, traveling halfway around the world. And although we had never seen one another until that day, we were going to spend the next 3 weeks or so very closely together. We were there to bring back these 3 first flyers released by North Vietnam. And let me say that meeting Dan Berrigan has been one of the most important moments of my life, really. Every day that we were in Hanoi, we were there for about a week, and every day that we were in Hanoi, we had a very, very full day. It was a busy time. And then at the end of the day, we both had our hotel rooms in this old French hotel. And at the end of the day, before going to sleep, Dan would come to my room, and he had traveled with a very tiny, I wouldn't call it a suitcase, something very small. But he pulled out of it every night a little bottle of cognac. And I had a feeling that there wasn't much else in this bag. So we would have a little bit of cognac, and then we would both retire. And the next morning, we would meet at breakfast, and Dan would have a poem. I don't know when he wrote it. I suppose it was while he slept. But every morning, another poem. And that was the beginning of my friendship with Dan, which would continue. He introduced me to what can I call it? The Catholic left? Dare I use the word left? The Catholic anti-war movement. To Phil and Liz and Tom and all the others, what a remarkable group. And then, of course, Dan and we became entangled with one another in a number of ways through the course of the movement against the war in Vietnam, a period when he came to Boston and was underground. And I was, as the FBI would say, his handler. But I could actually never handle him. And there were all those things he did afterward, which you know about, and from the Catonsville Nine through all of the others. And at one point he sent me, and my wife Roz sent us a poem which he had written in memory of Mitch Snyder, who was an advocate for the homeless in Washington, D.C., and who had just at a certain point found things too much for him and killed himself. And Dan wrote this poem in his honor. And you've actually heard some of those lines tonight from the Witness Against Torture People, but I want to read you the whole poem because I brought it with me to read. And in loving memory, Mitchell Snyder. Some stood up once and sat down. Some walked a mile and walked away. Some stood up twice, then sat down. I've had it, they said. Some walked 2 miles, then walked away. It's too much, they cried. Some stood and stood and stood. They were taken for fools. They were taken for being taken in. Some walked and walked and walked. They walked the earth. They walked the waters. They walked the air. Why do you stand, they were asked, and why do you walk? Because of the children, they said, and because of the heart, and because of the bread, because the cause is the heart's beat, and the children born, and the risen bread. Thank you.
That was the late, great Howard Zinn talking directly to Father Dan Berrigan, celebrating his 85th birthday. John Deere, if you can go through what, in the beginning, inspired Dan. I mean, you have Phil Berrigan and Dan Berrigan. Phil, I think, engaged in these actions a little earlier, maybe encouraged his brother to do the same. But talk about when Father Dan decided that this is the course of action he would take in his life.
Thank you, Amy. You know, we're talking about Dan as this great resistor. But, you know, he was famous in the early 60s as a poet. So he was actually a great literary person as well. I think one of the great poets of the time. And he's also a very serious religious leader as a Catholic priest. And so Dan entered the Jesuits in 1939. He and his family were very much pro-war. In the 50s, Dan is very involved in the church and as a teacher. What happened, and I pressed Phil on this, and Dan later, is that the FOR reached out to him around 1960, and to Thomas Merton, and to Thich Nhat Hanh, and got them really involved, the Fellowship of Reconciliation, in beginning to speak out against war and nuclear weapons. And then they went through this transformation with Thomas Merton, kind of under the guide of Dorothy Day, Dan's great friend, and she was really Dan's leader, if you will. And Dan was in Europe in 1964.
Founder of the Catholic Worker Movement, and explained who Thomas Merton is. Thomas
Merton was one of the most famous figures in Catholic Church history, a famous monk who wrote hundreds of books, actually. But in 1960, this never happened before, he began writing against racism and against war and in nuclear weapons. We'd never had this before. Literally in the United States, no one had ever done that except Dorothy Day. And to get such a prominent person who was really Dan's best friend, Thomas Merton, with Dorothy Day, then Phil saying, wait a second, to be a religious person is to serve the God of peace. To be a Christian is to follow Jesus, who's like Gandhi, a hero of nonviolence. Well, this has never been thought of like that before. But what was so bold was they decided to do it, and then they did it. By 64, 65, Merton led a famous retreat for Dan and Phil. And then they got really involved. Dan was kicked out of the country for beginning to speak out against the war.
Kicked out of the country by?
Well, these are great questions. For years, we thought it was the Cardinal of New York, who was a very famous pro-war leader, Cardinal Spellman. He used to go to Vietnam and literally bless the troops. Dan always thought it was him, but research was done, and we discovered about 10 years ago it was secretly the Jesuits themselves. Cardinal Spellman didn't do that. They kicked him out of the country to try to stop him for speaking out against war. But there was such an outcry. Friends took out a full-page ad in the New York Times. Dan came back, and then he got invited with the Cornell students to go to the big mobilization at the Pentagon. We're talking now October 1967, a week before Phil's Baltimore 4 action. Dan didn't plan to get arrested. All his student friends got arrested, so he got arrested, and the first priest to do so. And then Phil did the action, and then suddenly the invitation happened for him and Howard Zinn to go to Vietnam. We're now talking January 1968. If you study the correspondence with Merton and Phil, none of this was planned out. It was unfolding as the war was getting worse. They are now prominent people, but they're saying, okay, students are speaking and marching, and young people are marching against the war. The war is clearly getting worse. The election is going to happen. Robbie Kennedy hadn't got, so forth and so on. What are we going to do? And being in Vietnam changed Dan's life. And then the death of Martin Luther King kind of led Phil and Dan to take another step. And Amy, you know, listening to that quote, it's so hard and shocking, you know, to really imagine what they did. But when Dan said, our apologies, we apologize, sorry, dear friends, we can only burn paper instead of children. You know, the whole country freaked out that priests were breaking the law in opposition to the war. But very few were quite upset, you know, about the bombing and dropping of napalm upon millions of people in Vietnam. And the symbolic action of pouring napalm on draft files, leading to 300 other draft board raids, ending the draft. We know historically it ended the draft. It changed the Catholic Church, and it inspired tens of millions of people to take the streets. I would say that very seriously, having really studied it and talked at length with Dan and Phil about that. And then you'd say after prison, which was so horrible, Dan almost died in prison, well, they could rest on their laurels and be great heroes of the peace movement. Not at all. They kept going, addressed nuclear weapons. Phil founded Joan House, and then they did the Plowshares 8 at great cost. Dan's health has never been that great. He faced a good 10 years in prison. He eventually did not go to prison for that. But they kept at it. And Dan always continued his love of language. So powerful. That's why he's so interesting to listen to. And he was a great spiritual giant, certainly on the level of Dr. King and Gandhi and Dorothy Day, his friend, but also his other friends, Thomas Merton, Rabbi Abraham Heschel, close friend of Dan's, our friend Thich Nhat Hanh, the great Buddhist leader who's near death himself. They had a big celebration of Dan yesterday in Plum Village in France, and I've been in contact with him. So Dan, as a religious figure, saying, if you're going to pursue the spiritual life, you have to work to end the killing of sisters and brothers around the planet. This is a great gift Dan has given all of us, and a great hope and a symbol, and what a blessing, Amy, for all of us to have known him.
I want to end with two separate comments. This is from filmmaker and activist Michael Moore, who recorded a statement remembering Father Dan Berrigan.
I was deeply saddened this weekend to learn the news of the passing of Father Daniel Berrigan. But truth be told, I have throughout my life been overjoyed at the fact that both he and his brother Philip Berrigan were perhaps the main inspiration to me as a child, as an adolescent, a young 13-year-old back in Catholic grade school myself in Michigan, and being inspired by them and what they were doing to try and stop the Vietnam War. And I made a decision that basically I wanted to be them. And I was not your typical 13 or 14-year-old, but in many ways I was. And but one thing I knew for certain is that I wanted to do what they were doing. And I have to say that what I've been able to do throughout my life, I can draw a direct line back to following them, following their example, reading what they wrote, listening to what they had to say. And I've been asked many times in the past in terms of, who inspired me or who was a mentor to me or whatever. And if I had any heroes as a teenager, Daniel Berrigan and Philip Berrigan were at the top of the list. I'm sad to see him go, but I'm so glad that he was part of my life, of our lives, of this country's life, of this world. And I guess I'm optimistic knowing that there are so many millions of others just like him, maybe not as famous, but I know some of them are listening to this right now, some of you, who are in your own ways, in your own communities, doing the things that need to be done, fighting the good fight, continuing the struggle, and doing it with love and kindness and a sense of what's right and wrong and fair and just. And if we all keep doing that, then that means Daniel Berrigan lives on.
That was Michael Moore, and I want to end with Father Dan Berrigan, in his own words, in our Firehouse studio in 2002, reading a poem about his brother, Phil Berrigan.
An anniversary like this seems to me induces silence rather than a lot of words, but I'll try. A few minutes after this horrid event, a year ago, the phone rang. I was working at something, and a friend from North Carolina said, something terrible is happening in New York City, and I said, what, and so on and so forth. And my first reaction was, I guess, right out of the gut rather than the heart, and I blurted into the phone, so it's come home at last. Sympathy and tears came later, but that was the beginning. And I had a sense that that came from a very deep immersion in what I might call the hyphenated reality of America in the world, hyphen in the world. I was under American bombs in Hanoi in '68. We spent almost every night, Howard Zinn and myself, in bomb shelters. It was quite an educated moment to cower under the bombs of your own country. There was a period of very intense reflection after that. That would be in February. 3 months later, with my brother and 7 others, I went to Catonsville, Maryland, and burned the draft files. I had seen what napalm did to children and the aged and anybody within the swath of fire in Hanoi. I had seen what happened to Jesuit priests who get in the way of America in Salvador. In '84, I met with the Jesuits who were later murdered at the university there. I had tasted American courts and American prisons. I'm trying to explain my first reaction. So it's come home at last. Within a week or so, I opened the Hebrew Bible to the book called The Lamentations of Jeremiah, and I found there a very powerful antidote to the poison that was running deep in the veins of authority here. Evidently, this bystander of the destruction of the holy city was giving us permission to go through an enormously redemptive and healing labyrinth of emotions. Emotions that one would think superficially the Bible would not allow for. But he allows the bystanders and the survivors to speak of enormous hatred of God, a spirit of revenge against the enemy, guilt in view of one's own crimes and inhumanity, hatred of those who have wrought this upon us, etc., etc. These are all the tunnel, the very deep tunnel of psychology and spirit that the Bible opens before us. I began to understand that unless we went through that, we would never come out to the light again, and that that would be true of myself as well. I began to understand that the foreshortening of that lonely and difficult emotional trek was a clue to Mr. Bush and the war spirit, and that unless one were allowed the full gamut of human and inhuman emotions, one would come out armed and ready with another tat for tit.
That was Father Dan Berrigan speaking in 2002. He died on Saturday at the age of 94. I want to thank our guests, Frida Berrigan, John Deere, both in New York, and Bill Quigley here in New Orleans with me. That does it for our show. We will link to all our interviews with Dan Berrigan over the years at democracynow.org. Special thanks to Mike Burke, Jeremy Scahill, Dennis Moynihan, the whole team at Democracy Now!, Brendan Allen, Renee Feltz, Nermeen Sheikh, Dina Guzder, Carla Wills, everyone who made this broadcast possible, as well as Amy Littlefield and Sam Alcoff and Laura Gottesdiener. I'm Amy Goodman. This is Democracy Now!